right, well, let's get started. So on today, Wednesday, on Monday, we started talking about evolution. We talked about Darwin and some of the evidences that he saw, right? We talked about that modern definition of evolution being the change in allele frequencies in a population over time. Right? And just to kind of give you a reminder, so you're not forgetting about the genetics component of all of this, right? Even though we're really talking about phenotypes here, right? What we're seeing, natural selection acting on the phenotypes, right? Don't forget that it's the genotypes or those allele frequencies that underlie the phenotypes that we see, right? That'll become a major component of different aspects of evolution as we move throughout this unit. Right, we talked about the evidence that Darwin saw. Right? He saw evidences anywhere from the fossil record to how species were geographically distributed to homologies. Right? Even some modern homologies, like in molecular homologies, how DNA sequences can be really similar between species. And we started talking about one of those mechanisms of evolution, which would be natural selection. And we're going to continue talking about different mechanisms, including expanding upon natural selection. Right? So I know we've talked about this quite a bit, but we still haven't talked about it quite in depth enough. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me about the captions. Towards this end of the semester, I've been a little bit more spacey on that, so I appreciate the reminder. All right. So we're going to expand upon natural selection, right? And just as a reminder, right, natural selection is the differential survival and reproduction of individuals. So it's the environment acting upon the phenotype. Right? Some individuals are going to survive better than others, right? And those four criteria that we talked about have to be met. So there has to be overpopulation. There has to be variation. There has to be a fitness difference associated with that variation, and that variation has to be heritable. Right? So we already talked about this, so I'm just going to kind of skim through this so we can get on to some other new material. But I just really want to emphasize natural selection as a mechanism of evolution. The environment is doing the selecting. Right? And the environment is doing the selecting, and it's acting upon the phenotypes, even though we have those underlying genotypes present. Right? We might see predation or predators acting upon individuals, right? Predators in the environment. Maybe they're preferentially picking out different colored individuals. Maybe some taste better than other individuals. Right? There's also disease that can act upon populations. So this is the Tasmanian devil. They have a tumor disease in their population, kind of destroying their population, actually. It's kind of a sad story. But the presence of this disease, right, and them being in this environment will have them differentially surviving, right, due to these environmental pressures. Competition is also a big one. So whether that's competition for mates, competition for habitat, competition for food, right? There's multiple species out there in the same location competing with each other and competing within the species, right? So species to species competition, right? So the environment only has so much to offer, so the species are competing for that. Same with resources, right? Food resources. And we could think about it in terms of competition, right? Competition to get that food. But we can also think about it in terms of the environment and what the environment has to offer in terms of food, right? So in this image up here, I have a beautiful wildflower prairie, right? In this environment, the food resources will likely be foliage, it might be nectar, insects that are abundant in this prairie habitat, right? So the insects and flowers and all the organisms in this environment have adapted to this food resource. Right? We're not going to see individuals that might rely on tree nuts, for example. Right? So it's really the environment doing that selecting. That's such a huge emphasis on natural selection. Right? Natural selection cannot make perfect organisms. Right? This is one of those caveats and one of those common misconceptions. Right? Natural selection can only act on the variation that is present. Right? So if you think about maybe mice in a green field, for example, you might have brown mice, you might have white mice. Right? Natural selection is going to act upon those two phenotypes. Even if, right, if mice were to have green fur, maybe they would be better camouflaged or blended in. Right? But natural selection can't act upon a green fur type because it simply doesn't exist. Evolution is also going to be limited by historical constraints. Right? And when I mean historical constraints, I mean the evolutionary history of an organism up until that point. Right? So we're not going to be able to start over and remake an organism. Right? So I like this beaver cartoon up here. Right? We're not going to be able to start over and introduce robotics and machinery like a chainsaw hand into a beaver. Right? Natural selection is going to act upon those traits that are already present because of how they've evolved thus far. Many adaptations are often compromises, right? So they might not be the most perfect thing in the world. We might see the same structure having many different functions. And a really good example of that is one of those birds of paradise. Maybe you've seen some videos of their mating strategies. This particular bird of paradise here, the wings, not only act as a means of transportation, right, but also plays a crucial role in part of their mating strategies, where they spread out those wings and do those elaborate dances. And finally, the environment is unpredictable, right? So chance, natural selection, the environment, they're all going to interact, right? And we can't predict what's going to happen. Right? There's some unpredictability in natural selection. All right, if we dive into natural selection in a bit more of a detailed manner, right, depending on the population you're looking at, you can start to see different patterns emerge. Right? We're going to talk about the four main patterns, which would be directional, stabilizing, diversifying, or balancing selection. Right? That first one will be directional selection. Right? And so in a population that experiences directional selection, one of the extremes of their phenotypes is going to be selected. Just one of the extremes. And that's essentially going to shift the entire population towards that extreme. Right? So one of those examples that I have up here, again, is mice. Mice is such an easy example to use. I'm going to be using it quite often. Right? We have this population of mice, right, that is in a dimly lit forest. The initial population has a lot of these white-furred individuals and some of those brown-furred individuals. Right? Now you can imagine in a dark forest, those white individuals, they're going to stick out like a sore thumb. Right? They're probably going to be more easily predated upon because they can be found easier. And so over many generations, we see that these mice are going to turn towards more of this brown or this darker furred color. Right? And we can see this when we look at data. When we look at graphical representations of this data, we might see that our starting population, right, kind of has this kind of a nice bell curve to it, maybe a little bit more individuals having more of these extremes here, but not as many as having the white fur. Right? Once natural selection has acted upon this population, we see that our individuals actually shift to having more individuals having that dark fur. Right? We see the starting population has shifted towards one of those extremes. In this case, dark fur. All right, this is different from the stabilizing selection, right, where instead of an extreme being favored, it's actually the intermediate that's favored. So phenotypes that are at the extremes, they're not favored. They're actually selected against. It's those intermediate phenotypes that are favored, right? And again, a really good example of this, not mice this time, right? Something different. But we can look at clutch size of birds. Right? So if we look at the starting population here, we see we have this nice curve towards our the number of eggs that an individual might have in a nest, or a population might have in different nests. And we see that we can have few eggs in a nest or many eggs in a nest. And the starting population has a really wide range of number of eggs in nests. Now over time, we might see this population shift to favor that middle ground, to favor that middle number of eggs. So we don't see any nests having very few, and we don't see any nests having many. Right? Because in this case, if you produce too many eggs and too many offspring, you simply cannot provide for all of them. Right? You can't provide enough food, you can't provide enough care. Right? So that'll be selected against. Right? The other extreme of producing too few, right, you're simply just not producing enough offspring. You're not contributing enough offspring to the next generation to make this population continue. Right? So in this instance, that intermediate, not too many, not too few, are being favored. Right? So we're stabilizing that population. All right, we could also get disruptive or diversifying selection. Right? These two words, they're used interchangeably here. You hear diversifying selection, if you hear disruptive selection, they're talking about the same concept. Right? In this case, right, we're not favoring that intermediate. In this case, we're favoring both of the extremes. So not just one extreme, like in directional selection, right, but both extremes. And a good way to understand this is to look at the example of this colonial bent grass. Right? So colonial bent grass actually has some alleles that are very resistant to heavy metals. And so if they are growing on contaminated soils, right? So maybe for whatever reason there's been a company, a lot of times mining companies might have a lot of contaminated soils around their sites, right, with a lot of heavy metals. Right? This bent grass can actually grow in those contaminated soils. Right? But not all of them can. Right? So again, there's a distribution of phenotypes. Some have phenotypes that are more resistant to metals. Some have phenotypes that are less resistant to metals. Right? And in this case, we see a large patch of contaminated soil, but there's also these patches of uncontaminated soil. Right? The environment is very heterogeneous. Right? There's different patches of different soil types. Right? Now, the contaminated soil is going to favor having those grasses with the metal resistance alleles. Right? So those grasses that have that resistance to alleles are going to be able to, or resistance to metals, are going to be able to grow in that contaminated soil. So it's going to favor that one extreme of being resistant to metals. Right? But we also have these patches that are uncontaminated, right? And these patches are going to favor the other extreme that are not resistant to metals. Right? So we tend to see this bimodal distribution of individuals in these type of environments. The middle type of phenotype, so maybe you have individuals that might be slightly sensitive to metals or slightly resistant to metals. Right? They're not going to be favored. You either need to be resistant or you are not resistant. Right, the last one, right, balancing selection. This is where nothing's really happening if you're looking at the data. Right? We are maintaining genetic diversity. We are maintaining our allele frequencies. The alleles are being kept in balance over many generations. Right? So we're not shifting towards one extreme. We're not shifting towards the intermediate. We're staying the same. Right? And there are two common ways that this can occur. Right? The one is for a single gene, the heterozygote individual might be the most favored individual. Right? We've seen this with our examples of sickle cell disease. Right? Individuals that have sickle cell disease would be not as prominent, maybe as those that are heterozygous. So if you're heterozygous, you have the dominant allele and the non-dominant allele. Right? So you don't have sickle cell disease, but you carry the allele for it. And by carrying that allele, it offers some resistance to malaria. Right? So it's actually an advantage to be heterozygote, to carry the allele, right, but not have the disease itself. So that heterozygosity of the individuals is going to be favored. Right? We can also see it in this negative frequency dependent selection, right? And I don't have a good image of this up here, but this is where common individuals have a lower frequency. So the common phenotypes are lower in frequency. The rare phenotypes are higher in fitness and higher in frequency. And the way that it distributes out, it really just kind of balances the overall alleles in the population. Right? So again, big picture, nothing's really happening. We're keeping those allele frequencies pretty much the same. All right, let's take a step back and try to interpret a couple of graphs here. I want you to determine what type of natural selection or what pattern is happening in each of these graphs. Of bird body size, right? What type of pattern are we seeing? Directional, yes. We are seeing directional selection in action. We are favoring the extreme of having a larger body size. What about birth weight in human babies? What type of pattern are we seeing? Yeah, we're seeing stabilizing selection. Right? We're stabilizing because we are favoring that intermediate of a baby being not too light or not too heavy. Right? The intermediate body weight there tends to be the most healthy in these individuals. Any questions about those patterns? I'll say it's likely you'll probably see a graph and have to interpret what type of pattern is happening here. All right, since we're talking about natural selection, right, we're also going to talk about sexual selection because that's a form of natural selection, right? And this is where individuals with certain traits are going to more likely or more successfully engage with individuals, with other individuals over a separate group of individuals, right? So we're favoring some type of sexual selection in choosing mates, right? And in many species, we often are going to see male characteristics being more intensely affected than in female characteristics, right? So for example, male peacocks here have this huge plumage. Females do not, right? So often these sexual differences will be more exhibited in males, not always, but more often than not. We can have intra-sexual selection, which is where it's like male-to-male competition over a female or over a mate. But we can also see intersexual selection, where it's more of the female's choice. Right? And when it's more of the female's choice, this is when we're going to see the big plumages on peacocks, or we might see really elaborate dances in like those birds of paradise, right? So sexual selection is a thing, and it's a form of natural selection. Right? And this is going to be really important when we start talking about Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium on Friday. So yes, be prepared to do math on Friday. So a little bit of math that we're actually going to do in bio. Because we want to talk about non-random meeting. Right? So non-random meeting, you are preferentially selecting one individual over another. Now this non-random mating can be assortative. Right? So individuals with similar phenotypes are going to be more likely to mate. Right? Or it could be disassortative. Right? So the opposite being true. Individuals of dissimilar phenotypes are going to be most likely to mate. Right? So depends on the species we're talking about and how they have evolved over time, which one they might, or which category they might fall into. Another example of non-random mating would be inbreeding. Right? So this is where individuals that are genetically related will mate with one another. And inbreeding in particular can have some negative consequences. Right? So if we look at inbreeding, we're not going to favor a particular allele, but what we will see occurring over many generations is that we will start to see more homozygous individuals than heterozygous individuals. Now that could be homozygous dominant, that could be homozygous recessive, right? But the homozygous individuals are going to be preferred. Yes? It can be. Yeah. So my next slide here is that yes, we can have some negative consequences, especially in regard to recessive alleles. A lot of times it's recessive alleles that carry the disease, right? So sickle cell anemia is one of them. You have to have 2 recessive alleles to have that disease, right? There's a lot of different diseases that are associated in the recessive gene, right? And so when we start to have homozygous recessive individuals, that disease becomes more prominent in the population, right? So specifically with inbreeding, we get these homozygous individuals. We often say that individuals that are heterozygous have an advantage because they have the diversity of alleles and they're not fixed at either being dominant or recessive. I think now we're getting more into like societal. Yes, there's a lot of like genetic diseases that can be passed down in humans, but the same process also occurs in other organisms. They're just not as common. We don't know about them because we often hear about human inbreeding more than inbreeding in other organisms, right? One of the classic examples of inbreeding and how it's negative towards the population are the Florida panthers. So Florida panthers have a really low population, and they've been inbred for so long that we actually see a pretty low survivorship of the offspring. But there's been some studies where they have introduced some Texas panthers into the Florida panther population, so increasing the genetic diversity again, trying to reduce some of that inbreeding, and we see a much higher survivorship. Okay, inbreeding is very fascinating. All right, well that was all examples of non-random mating. I just wanted to briefly put in there that random mating can happen. All right, where you're equally likely to mate with individuals in the population. Right, you're not selecting one individual over the other, but this is pretty rare. Right, in nature, this usually is only random if it's hard to detect who you're mating with. So a lot of ocean species, for example, will release egg and sperm into the water and just hope that they'll connect and make an individual, right? They have no idea who they're mating with. But pretty rare in nature. All right, so let's do another review here. I want you to determine which of these pairs represents dissociative mating. right? And then whether these coral polyps are likely random or non-random mating. All right, so which one of these frog pairs would be disassortive mating? Yes, the first one. They are meeting with an individual that does not look like themselves, right? The other pair would be assortive mating. And then if we look at these coral polyps, right, would this be an example of random or non-random mating? I'm hearing whispers, but I can't pick out the words. Random, yes, it would be random mating, right? They don't have eyes. They don't know who they're mating with. This is also a really good example of them just releasing their gametes into the water and hoping for the best, right? A lot of random mating tends to happen in water, or wind dispersal would be another great example of it on wind. Right? Like trees releasing their pollen and just hoping that the pollen lands on another tree. They're not picky about who it lands on. All right, any questions about sexual selection? All right, we're going to talk about the other types of mechanisms for evolution beyond natural selection. Natural selection is obviously the big one. There's a lot going on there. But there's other mechanisms by which evolution in a population can occur. One of them is genetic drift, right? So genetic drift has nothing to do with the environment. It's totally due to some random occurrence. Right? It's not based on how an individual looks or acts, for example. It's unrelated to fitness. It's completely random. Right? When genetic drift happens, we tend to see populations over many generations either favor an allele or lose an allele. Right? This is more common with populations that are smaller than larger. So in this example up here, we have two populations that have a sample size of 10 individuals. Right? And we can see that over successive generations here, one population is going to be fixed to be all dominant alleles, so capital B, right? Which leads to this brown phenotype. Right? The other in the population here will be fixed in the opposite direction, be all recessive, so little b, little b. Right? So over time, something random has occurred which has led to this population being fixed, or it has completely lost the opposite allele. Now if we look at a population of maybe like 1,000 individuals, like this middle line here, we see that this fixation or loss of allele really doesn't happen at least as fast. Maybe if we looked at this over the course of 1,000 generations instead of 50, maybe we would see something, right? But in these larger populations, they have enough individuals to maintain genetic diversity. Right? So, genetic drift, happening due to these random chance events, right? And genetic drift often happens, right, when we get an event that leads to a small population, which then will go on to fix an allele type or lose an allele type. Right? So the size of that population is going to be dramatically reduced through some chance event. Right? Now there's two types of events that are the most common, right? One being a bottleneck effect, one being a founder effect. We'll talk about the bottleneck effect one first here. Oh, there we go. So the bottleneck effect is when the population is dramatically reduced and then is rebuilt due to some environmental happening, right? Some random events in the environment causing that population to dramatically be increased, right? So we're randomly eliminating members. Doesn't matter what they look like, doesn't matter their genotype or phenotype. Right? And those surviving members, after that cataclysmic event has occurred, right, might have a different allele frequency than the original population. And so I have this example of frogs in a pond up here. You can see that in our original population, we have green frogs, we have yellow frogs, we have yellow striped frogs. Right? Now, random chance, this environment went through a drought. Right? That drought dried up the pond, killed off a lot of the frogs, killed off a large portion of that population, and by chance, all of the green frogs died. Right? Now, when this population is rebuilt, say it rains again, that pond is refilled with water, right? They're able to expand their population. We see that that population is much different from that starting population because we no longer have green frogs. Right? It was that random event that caused that change in allele frequency. We eliminated the green frogs. Right? And so that new population has less genetic variation. Right? The other type of genetic drift that can occur would be a founder effect. It's the same concept. Right? The same concept where we're dramatically reducing a population. Right? But now, instead of something happening to the population, this is where a subset of individuals will go on to found a new population. Right? So up here we have a population of butterflies, and 3 of those butterflies are going to fly away to a new island and establish a new population. Right? We're dramatically reducing that population size of the new population, right? Even though it wasn't death that caused that dramatic reduction in size, it was just simply some of them moving away. And again, by chance, we have lost the allele for the white butterfly. Right? So that new population has less genetic variation than the original. Yes, Meg? They may have decided to move for whatever reason, or it could have been that the subset of the population got caught in air currents that drove them away. Right? It could have been a random event. It could have been individuals in a new environment and just staying put as they like in a new environment. A good example of people choosing to go to a new environment is the Amish population of Pennsylvania. Right? So they're also a really good example of a founder effect. So in Pennsylvania, a subset of those individuals decided to form a new population. Right? They just happened to be Amish, and they moved away, established a new colony. Right? Now, by chance, those individuals that moved away had the alleles for polydactyly. Right? And so this population that was established over successive generations, they actually have a higher frequency of polydactyly, or having 6 fingers, than the population that they were established. Right? So there's human examples of this happening as well. All right, another review. I have 2 questions up on the board here. And so for this first question, the population of frogs, right, skin color can be dark green or light green. Their main predator prefers to eat the dark-skinned frogs. Over many generations, only light-skinned frogs remain. Is this an example of genetic drift? And I want you to think about maybe how you would explain that answer to me. And the second question is that due to hunting, right, the population of northern elephant seals were reduced to 20 individuals at the end of the 19th century. Since then, their population has rebounded to over 30,000. Is this a founder effect or a bottleneck effect? So take about a minute or 2 here to read over those questions again and come to your conclusions. Visualize it a little bit. Yeah. All right, so this first question here, pertaining to frogs and a predator coming in and eating the dark-skinned frogs. Is this an example of genetic drift? No, I see a lot of heads shaking no. Yeah, Max, do we have an addition to that answer? Yes. Yeah, this is not random, right? They're preferentially being selected. Predators are doing the selection here, so no, this is natural selection. This is not genetic drift. Right? So it's not a random event, it's the environment doing the selecting. What about this second example here with the elephant seals? Right? They were down to 20 individuals and then rebounded to 30,000. Is this a founder effect or a bottleneck effect? It's a bottleneck effect. Yeah, we don't see individuals migrating, right? We just see some environmental effect. In this case, there was a human-mediated effect of reducing their population size, and then it rebounded back. Right? Any questions on genetic drift? All right, we're going to go to our next 2 examples of mechanisms of evolution here. The next one is gene flow, right? Often called migration. Right? Gene flow occurs when 2 different populations of individuals of the same species will intermingle with each other. Right? So in the case of my example up here, we have 2 populations of deer. One is light-furred, the other is dark-furred. Right? They happen to be in contact with each each other because they found a pass in the mountain range, which allowed for migration to happen. And now we see some of the light individuals intermixing with those darker individuals and vice versa, right? So we're increasing our genetic diversity in this case, right? These two populations that were isolated are now intermingling with each other, and we're increasing the allele frequency between these two populations, right? It's important to note that when we have this occurring, right, we have kind of like a pie chart example here, that when migration occurs, it causes a change in allele frequencies in both of those populations, not just one, right? Because there's migration back and forth, right? Another example of this would be with our birds. We have bluebirds and we have redbirds on either side of a mountain, right? These bluebirds are homozygous dominant, so capital H, capital H. The redbirds are homozygous recessive, little h, little h. If migration occurs, right, and they mate with one another, their offspring is going to be heterozygous, big H and a little h. So we're introducing that allele back into the population, we're increasing that genetic diversity. I might guess that this could be a result of inbreeding. It could be just like a chance event that could occur, so genetic drift. Maybe they just by chance kill all the individuals with the dominant allele. Yeah, there's multiple different ways that could happen. Yeah. All right, our last type of mechanism from evolution is simply mutations. Right? Mutations are increasing the genetic variation, right, by potentially introducing new phenotypes. So not all mutations are going to lead to a change in phenotype, but some of them can, right? And that can increase the genetic variation in a population. And again, this is random, right? This is happening randomly. So again, if we have a population of mice, right, this population being predominantly brown mice, and we have a mutation that causes a white mouse individual to enter the population, over many generations, we can see that that new phenotype becomes more prominent. We have increased our genetic variation in the resulting generations. Right. Now, these mutations, again, we know mutations can be beneficial or detrimental. They affect the phenotype. In this case here, right, it could be detrimental in that this white individual here, if it happened to occur in a population living in a darker environment, like a forest floor, that might stick out a little bit more. And that might not be so beneficial for those individuals, right? But the opposite could be true if it happened to occur in a habitat that's more lightly colored. Maybe it's snowing most of the year. Now these white individuals would blend in a little bit better, and that mutation could be beneficial. Right? All right, what do we have for time here? Oh, we have like 3 minutes. So I want you to take the last 3 minutes to think about this question here. Would you expect an increase or a decrease in genetic diversity over time for these different mechanisms of evolution? right, so let's take the last minute here to go through the answers. Natural selection is going to increase or decrease genetic diversity? I hear a little bit of both, which is good because, yes, it could do either, right? If it's balancing, it kind of maintains that genetic diversity, right? Directional, stabilizing, diversifying could decrease. You could argue that diversifying could potentially increase by favoring the extremes. What about genetic drift? Yeah, decrease. What about gene flow? Increase and mutation? Increase. Yes. All right, very good. We will end there. You do have a content check due on Friday. It is up on Moodle. And I would be prepared to do some simple math on Friday.